Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Lorgar's discovery, Lorgar's Betrayal in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Index Asteroots, Emperor's Children. Origins. When the Primarchs were stolen away from the Emperor's grasp, they landed on worlds throughout the galaxy. Each of them, in their own way, became a hero of that world, leading it to new prominence in the galaxy, although with that prominence came a revelation of the fragility that all of the Primarchs' home worlds shared. Thus some of the Primarchs, by tragic circumstances or by their own actions, killed their home worlds. Fulgrim was the only one that, even before the Emperor's arrival, saved his. Chemos before Fulgrim was a mining world that had become isolated from its markets during the warp storms of the Age of Strife. No longer able to import food or refined products, it found itself unable to rebuild itself to be self-sufficient. Ancient machinery gradually broke down, the people of Chemos compensating by working harder. Only it was not enough, and Chemos fell into a spiral of entropy that, by Fulgrim's time, had reached an end state, incomprehensible technology maintained by ever-shrinking cities with no time for recreation, leisure, or art. Without the Primarch, it is likely Chemos would have been a dead world when the Crusade found it. Fulgrim was found by the planetary police force, the caretakers, who were so impressed with the infant's beauty that they raised him despite a general custom of putting orphans to death so as not to spend resources on them. As all the Primarchs, he grew rapidly, and came to understand that his world was dying. Fulgrim could do the work of 2 adult laborers by the age most children started working, but what mattered far more was his innate management engineering talent. He intuitively understood how the technology of Chemos worked and, what is more, how to improve it. The executives of Chemos were initially skeptical of the child prodigy's proposals, but they were soon convinced by those proposals' great success. Under the direction of the young Primarch, who became known as the Eagle Star, industry improved in efficiency by great leaps, abandoned factories were reclaimed, and contact between the cities of Chemos was re-established. He grew to be acknowledged as ruler of the entire planet through consensus. Chemos had long emphasized meritocracy, allowing those most fit to rule to do so, and there was no one else who even approached Fulgrim's merit. While the Eagle Star did not stop personally working long hours, free time did gradually return to the lives of Chemos' population, time that Fulgrim encouraged to be used in artistic activities, the cultural heritage of the world being reclaimed from ancient ruins and reforged in brilliance. Yet Fulgrim did not stop there. He knew from the histories that Chemos had once been in communication with other worlds. He read, too, about the travel through the warp that enabled interstellar distances to be crossed on human timescales. Thus he sanctioned a project to attempt to recreate the warp drive. In this, however, he failed. When the kinks were thought to have been worked out, the triumphant first manned flight ended in fire and madness, leaving a great warp storm in the midst of the easiest route to access Chemos by. Crushed by the loss, and certain that it was his fault, Fulgrim responded by intensifying studies into the warp, along with safety standards on those experiments. He did not lose focus on completing the rebuilding of Chemos, turning it into a paradisaical planet filled with great gardens while its industry was modified to be maximally aesthetic and maximally sustainable, but he made it a personal project to perfect the warp drive after all. And being a Primarch, he succeeded. Not long after contact was established with the nearest systems in the still accessible directions, the Eagle Star flew a great starship called the Renewal, as both its captain and its navigator equivalent, on a great mission of exploration. There, he heard the first rumors of an expanding imperium of man. Yet the rumors flowed in the opposite direction as well, and 2 years into Fulgrim's mission, the Renewal encountered, in orbit around the planet Torch, the Emperor of Mankind's Bucephalus. The Great Crusade. Fulgrim recognized his father as soon they met, and knelt without a word. Chemos was pledged to the Imperium, and the Eagle Star flew to Terra to meet his gene sons. But while the Third Legion had the same formal rank as the other legions, it did not have the numbers. Its gene seed stocks had been lost to sabotage, and without the Primarch's presence restoring it was an inefficient process. Yet the Asteroots of the Third refused to fight less intensely for it, and so the Legion was on the verge of extinction. The entire Legion was called back to Terra to meet Fulgrim, yet it numbered less than 20 Asteroots. Fulgrim gave a grand speech to the Legion's remnants, one that confirmed their name as the Emperor's children and affirmed their sole right to wear the imperial aquila on their armor, yet it was clear that it would take years, even with the Eagle Star's presence, for them to rebuild their numbers to effective combat strength. Thus Fulgrim remained on Terra, and there he met his brothers. This was the peak of the Great Crusade, in a sense, a time when those who would become the greatest of the Primarchs knelt to their father in quick succession. Alpharius had been recently found, and Magnus would be rediscovered a few years after Fulgrim left Terra. Yet the Primarch found immediately after Fulgrim, and the one with which the Eagle Star forged the closest link, was Robert Guilliman. Fulgrim and Guilliman learned about the Imperium together, and together they dreamed of its future. They embraced the Emperor's vision: unity, secularism, grandeur, and above all eternity. They did compete with each other in little things such as the decoration of their flagship, but both ultimately, more than anything, wished to see mankind triumphant. And when the Emperor's children, then 5,000 strong, not counting the initiates still on Terra and Chemos, first set off on the Great Crusade after Fulgrim's arrival, it was Guilliman's fleet that the refurbished renewal flew alongside. Our Primarch was raised on a world without war. That, in itself, is irony enough, but what some have found strange is that he has not been repulsed by conflict, and indeed has embraced it more than many of his brothers who were generals since youth. But while Chemos lacked war, it had not forgotten it. What had by Fulgrim's time become huddled fortress factories had once been cities mighty enough to war with one another over resources, and Fulgrim heard tales of military glory in his youth just as we did. The Primarch could, of course, recognize the wars of declining Chemos as futile, but he saw, as we did, that the Great Crusade was no ordinary war. Fulgrim entered the Great Crusade with the same desire to prove himself as each Astarte does when he is first recruited. Yet he also entered it with the demonstration of a broken legion, and the friendship of a Primarch who had lost his family to meaningless war. He was no fool dreaming of glory, yet he was aware that war can be glorious, legion war more than most. That is, I suspect, why he ever demands control of the legion's theaters of war. If a world can be turned to the Imperium by diplomacy, Fulgrim will do so. If a realm must be raised with no chance of peaceful integration, he will end it in brilliantly elegant fashion. But Fulgrim despises meaningless war against reasonable human domains, even to the point of allowing others to fight such wars without our legion's support. And he is right to do so. There is glory and beauty in war, but not in the sort of warfare that helped end Chemos. From the writings of Lord Commander Vespasian. Yet Fulgrim grew close to others too. He respected the sheer focus of Leman Russ and Perturabo, even if he found them somewhat monomaniacal about war, especially Perturabo. His closest friendship besides that with Guilliman was with Ferrus Manus, mainly due to the latter's genius in creation both mechanical and social. Other Primarches, however, disappointed Fulgrim when he met them. With Angron and Sanguinius, this was merely a feeling of a lack of dedication, one that would later be explained by those two Primarches having in truth incompatible goals with the Emperors. Sanguinius especially had a rivalry with Fulgrim, one that both Primarches commemorated in art, symbolized by their mutual use of the wing motif. But worst was Rogaldorn, whose regressive nihilism Fulgrim couldn't not despise. It took most of a century for the numbers of the Emperor's children to finally reach the Emperor-given nominal size of 100,000 Astaroths. It would have taken even longer, but Fulgrim did hold his legion back from battle when necessary, for he remembered all too well its state upon his meeting them. For the rebirth of his world and his legion both, he became known as the Phoenician by the Imperium, though he kept the eagle and star as his personal sigil. Yet none could deny the Emperor's children did fight with great determination, especially when their numbers had finally stabilized, for their gene seed infrastructure was greater than any other legions. On a world ironically called Flogrim, for a myth distantly related to the one the Phoenician had been named for, they met a population of techno-barbarian fanatics terrified of the Imperium, yet they were conquered when Fulgrim engineered an eclipse of the local star by Flogrim's rings that sent the people into panic as the Emperor's children attacked them, ensuring victory without a single legionary life lost. But sometimes, Fulgrim knew, victory could only be achieved with the combination of willpower, tactics, and blood, as against the psychic arachnids known as the Ice Exat. There, thousands of Emperor's children lost their lives in brutal warfare throughout the 100-world empire, yet after Fulgrim forced the aliens' main fleet into a pincer, the Legion achieved victory over a region the Imperial army had unsuccessfully besieged for 5 Terran years in 3 months. In either type of war, Fulgrim demanded nothing less than perfection from his warriors, but with awareness that said perfection was impossible, and that in some wars victory was easier than in others. Thus, before his arrival, the Legion had followed a custom of toasting to the victory to come before a battle. Fulgrim allowed the custom to continue, but soon changed it to a more somber ceremony that reflected duty rather than pride alone, though that pride never faded, as Fulgrim saw it as a useful element of his Legion's culture to demand the best from themselves. Not too long after the war against the Ice Exat, Fulgrim joined Guilliman once more. This time their fleets combined to the full strengths of 2 legions, and was joined by other forces including the Emperor of Mankind himself. Then, they flew out to fight perhaps the greatest campaign of the Great Crusade, against the most powerful Xeno Empire yet encountered, the Olaner campaign. The campaign against the Orcs of Olaner was planned as much by Fulgrim and Guilliman as by the Emperor himself. It was a complete, brilliant success. Fulgrim's inherent optimism balanced out Guilliman's tendency towards caution to cut the Empire into pieces, and ensure that its leader would face the Emperor and the 2 Primarches alone, a doomed battle for the Xeno. Only a few Orcs escaped the doom of Olaner, and most were hunted down in the following years, with the exception of a single survivor that would become the Beast. The victory of Olaner was followed by a great triumph, and it was there that Fulgrim and Guilliman were pronounced War Masters, left to lead the Great Crusade in the Emperor's stead. There, too, they were first warned of the true dangers of chaos. Some would have taken that knowledge as a sign to shrink away from psychic power and fear. Fulgrim did not, and indeed expanded his legion's librarium while encouraging the acceptance of psychic power throughout the Imperium. This would, for instance, prove crucial in cleansing the Xeno world of Laeran from chaos taint. But the Emperor's children retained, too, their reputation as fearsome warriors in person, without the aid of such abilities. They were, nonetheless, undoubtedly artists and builders as well as strategists and warriors. The worlds around Chemos, unified into a realm of eagles, became garden worlds that combined the appearance of wild nature with great industrial output, a rival to Ultramar, especially after the warp storm impeding trade was cleared by the combination of time and the Thirds Librarium. Perfection is an aim, Rabut, an aim that I will always strive for but that I know full well is unattainable. And that means that no one is perfect. Not even our Father. Yes, I know that, though he might not say it. He would prefer to have the Libraria be ended, perhaps even the entire 15th, but to do so would be hypocrisy. The warp exists, as do the monsters within it. If we deny that, in word or in deed, we put a conscious flaw into the Imperial truth, and with that intentional weakness, the entire body of the Imperium's ideals would be corrupt, and doomed. Fulgrim Eaglestar. But while Fulgrim and Guilliman pushed the edge of the Crusade ever forward to the edge of the galaxy, the glory of the Imperium's golden age turned in upon itself. The Great Betrayal. Guilliman had concerns about certain fleet movements in the months before the Great Betrayal, but Fulgrim reassured him that the movements were almost certainly innocent. To be fair to the Phoenician, however, the only alternative explanation was the beginning of open rebellion, and only Alpharius could conceive such a possibility at the time. When news did come to the War Masters, they hurried to Terra immediately, even as they ordered forces to intercept the traitors' fleets, the Second Fleet specifically, when that division became clear. But while Fulgrim and Guilliman were not too distant from either each other or Terra when news of Istvan came, to return in time was still a task only the best ships in either fleet could achieve, and Fulgrim was further from Terra than Guilliman. 40,000 Ultramarines arrived on Terra, but only 20,000 Emperor's children, for there was only one ship in the latter fleet fast enough to reach the throne world in time, the Renewal, refurbished yet again with the Mechanicum's most advanced technology for the Phoenician upon his ascension to War Master. The ship had never truly been intended to carry even half as many warriors, and so most of the Legion's crusading strength was left behind to fight the galaxy-wide war, under the command of Lord Commander Eidolon. In the meantime, Fulgrim landed on Terra, embracing Guilliman and Corax through tears as the 3 Primarches prepared to defend the Imperial Palace, once again under their father's command. Yet their plans were dealt a heavy setback, because that Emperor could not fight on the front lines. The Webway project had been the Emperor's reason for returning to Terra, a grand plan to allow interstellar travel without the aid of the warp. Yet in its unfinished state, It was also a severe security vulnerability, and while attempting to seal that vulnerability, the Emperor was hurt, and hurt grievously. When the First Fleet landed, he was further wounded by Fukin, after which he could fight only for brief periods of time without completely ruining his recovery, though it is believed he would have recovered, in time. As the First Fleet fell upon Terra, according to the hastily rewritten battle plan, Fulgrim and the Asteroutes with him attempted to harass the landing sites of the White Scars, Doomfists, and Iron Warriors, both to ensure some casualties and prevent them from coming to the Salamanders' aid while the Custodes and Raven Guard fell upon them, and the Ultramarines held the palace. Fulgrim briefly crossed blades with Perturabo in this time, forcing the Lord of Iron on the defensive but being forced to retreat long before the duel could be decided. And then the siege began. The Iron Warriors battered the walls of the Imperial Palace, ever on the front line, while the White Scars attacked lesser strongholds across Terra, and the Salamanders and Fists fought together in a more cautious fashion. Fulgrim noted the disunity within the traitors' ranks as early as the third day of the siege, and did his best to exploit it. Sallies between the gaps in the traitors' lines were undertaken, notably, Captain Marius Veroshan led a mission against the White Scars camp that opened a sinkhole underneath it, leaving the 5th Legion without a main base. For all those minor victories, the traitors had a numerical advantage in a great deal of weaponry and psychic power both, and the Loyalists were taking heavy losses, and so Fulgrim and Guilliman were forced to plan for a contraction of their perimeter. Many forces were withdrawn to the inner palace, and the traitors were on the edge of a major breakthrough, but Mort Arian arrived just in time. As soon as the 14th and its vast fleet were spotted above Terra, ancient Rylaner lifted the Renewal out of its hiding place in the palace, and the great flagship broke the traitor lines, leading the rest of the fleet hidden on Terra into an attack that broke the First Fleet's naval elements. The ground forces were stunned as Fulgrim and Guilliman led a counter-attack, now supported by the Death Guard's bombardment and landing. Soon after, the Space Wolves arrived on Terra along with a large Emperor's Children detachment under Captain Solomon Demeter. The 4 legions of the First Fleet reduced to scattered holdfasts, less than 1 in 3 of their legionaries left alive. But 2 days before every expectation, the orbit of Neptune bled with etheric fire, and the Second Fleet came to Sol. Mort Arian led the orbital battle, yet it was a bloodier affair than expected, with the full power of chaos sorcery being brought to bear against the Imperium for the first time. The mortal crew of the Renewal, for instance, were corrupted by a foul ritual, and Rylaner was forced to give his own life in destroying the flagship. The palace's walls, however, held firmer than ever, to the extent that Fulgrim granted Russ's request to fight the traitors outside them, defending Terra's remaining civilians. Even the most successful assault of the Lion's engines only resulted in Guilliman meeting the first Primarch, being knocked unconscious for days but beating the attack back. It was in the tunnels below that the Word-Bearers, Iron Hands, and Dark Angels were closest to a breakthrough, but Demeter and Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard held them back there as well. Yet it was not easy, any of it. Eidolon found that out to his own doom in the Galactic War, when he attacked Hydra Cordatus, which seemed to be a lightly defended rebellious world. He died under a tide of daemons, one only stopped with great difficulty after First Captain Julius Caesauron took command. The realm of Eagles too came under attack, by the Veneist, a coalition of Xeno-species once thought defeated that struck deep into the Imperium, among them a small number of the dread Rangdan. It was Saul Tarvitz, the highest-ranking officer in the region, who rallied the local strength of the Legion and of the Imperial Army and saved the realm of Eagles in a lengthy holding action, the invasion's back being broken when Caesauron hurried back to Chemos with 20,000 Asteroutes, though it would take centuries for some of the worlds the Veneist took to be cleansed. On Terra itself, though the fighting reached a fever pitch, as Lorgar and Ferrus Manus themselves led a subterranean attack. Garrow and Demeter found their defenses either evaded with ease or smashed through, Demeter being killed by Ferrus. Yet the inner palace was as well defended as any fortress of the time. Fulgrim and Guilliman had designed those defenses to divide an attacking force into smaller fragments, yet Asteroutes were needed to ensure this happened without the walls being left undefended, a task which Lord Commander Vespasian volunteered to lead. 500 Emperor's Children and 500 Ultramarines fought against 10,000 traitorous Asteroutes and their demonic allies. Of them all, only one survived, yet their task was achieved. The traitors' host was left in tatters, Ferrus Manus turned back, and with Horus on the way it was clear the Imperial Palace was no longer under threat. Yet the Emperor still was. For Lorgar, alone but guided by the whispers of chaos, continued his march to the throne room. And so Fulgrim, sending the Emperor to a safer location, clashed with the arch-traitor in the heart of the Imperium. Fulgrim looked at the mangled body of his son. Alone of Vespasian's 1,000, Lucius would live outside the shell of a dreadnought, though even surviving within a dreadnought would have been a miracle. Fabius was brilliant, truly brilliant, even if he needed to be held back from going too far all too often. Even Lucius's face would retain its beauty, though perhaps one or two faint scars would remain. Beauty. Not beauty in the simple sense of attractiveness, but majesty. That had been why he had been spared in his first day of life on Chemos, when he had not even been fully conscious yet. It was something innate. Something given by his father. Something that did not depend on him. And Fulgrim tensed, as he remembered Vespasian's insistence that Fulgrim stay behind, as a last defense for the Emperor. He knew his Lord Commander had been entirely correct, but it had hurt all the more for it. It had hurt to sit back, for nearly the entirety of the siege. He lifted unending, inspecting the long sword Rabut had forged for him what seemed like an eternity ago. Now Rabut lay unconscious, mangled by the lion. Mort Arian was fighting the Void War at Iapetus. Lehman was half a world away, fighting in southern Africa last Fulgrim had heard. Corax was completing the violent mothballing of the webway. Fulgrim was glad, in truth, that none of them were available. He needed to do this alone. To test himself, not against Lorgar, for Lorgar, while a primarch, had never been among the more martial of his brothers, but against the warp entities that backed him. For those self-titled gods were, without doubt, greater than he was. And what was the point of fighting, if not as a test against the impossible? A beep on his collar told him it was time, and he walked into the throne room, locking the door. His father would understand, when he awoke. If he fell, the psychic wards would switch back, and Lorgar would find himself trapped, to face the Emperor and the Custodes in due time, but for now, he would try this alone. Because the wall was shattering, revealing a golden-headed prince, one whose armor was carved with intricate eye-painting writings down to the micrometer, one who seemed to set the air around himself ablaze with golden fire. The psychic aura was greater than Fulgrim had ever felt around one who was not his father, and even the Emperor rarely let his power show as strongly as this seeming demigod did. Because Lorgar was here. You. Lorgar roared in shock as he entered. Not even father. You, for all mankind. For everything, Fulgrim said, readying unending. But above all, for the audacity of our dream. He had held back for the entire siege. He had held back, in a sense, for the entire crusade. His legion could not have survived otherwise. But now, as two blades crashed in the last duel of humanity's greatest war, Fulgrim held nothing back. The duel took no less than an hour. Without chaos, it would have been an easy victory for Fulgrim. As it was, Lorgar was empowered by dark energies. None knows what truly happened in that time, but when the Emperor rushed into the room he saw both combatants mortally wounded. But as the Emperor took Fulgrim's hand in that moment, Lorgar unleashed his foulest ritual. He sacrificed his very soul. Many believe it was to wound the Emperor, but in truth Lorgar did not have that level of control. Instead, he burned his soul in order to unleash a massive explosion, one that would have left the heart of Segmentum Solar, including humanity's home world, at the center of a warp storm. The Emperor and Primarches would have lived, but the population of the Imperium's core would not have been so lucky, and the Imperium itself would have suffered a wound that would probably have been fatal. And so the Emperor took the attack's force upon his own body, and thus, in the span of minutes, the Imperium had lost its brightest star, its worst traitor, and its incarnate leader. The escape. The Legion reacted in different ways to the loss of its leader, father, and savior, for the third was more devoted to its primarch than almost any other legion. As the traitors' ships fled Terra, many of the Emperor's children that remained on the throne world simply stood in shock. Others reacted by sharpening their will and their hate. Julius Caesarion, upon taking command of the Legion, led a punitive fleet against Nuceria, the home world of the World Eaters, a legion that had abandoned Terra at the battle's height, for reasons that were still a mystery at the time. Commanding a vast armada containing most of the Legion's remaining strength from the greatest ship remaining in the Third Legion's fleet, the pride of the emperor, he flew with the aim of destroying Nuceria via exterminatus, as vengeance for Fulgrim, leaving Tarvitz to hold Chemos once again. When the flotilla reached Nuceria's system, though, things did not go according to plan. The World Eater's intact fleet was orbiting the planet, and upon Ka'Soron's arrival quickly began a retreat. The Emperor's children sought to cut it off, yet Ka'Soron could not truly stop a Primarch from leading a fleet almost as large as his own to disengage. He did his best nevertheless, single-mindedly cutting off all routes of retreat he could spot. Perhaps he would even have succeeded in forcing a battle, if not for two events. The first was Angren's psychic message, one that promised ill fortune to any who fought a battle on both sides, a psychic command of retreat that shocked the Third's librarians into being of little use for the rest of the fight. It was from this message that one of the most powerful of those librarians, Anguis the Inverter, later deduced the truth of the 12th's allegiance. The second was the decision by Captain Karn of the World Eaters to ignore that command and cover the retreat of the fleet's remainder. Ka'Soron stubbornly fought to contain the World Eaters nevertheless, in a magnificent net of precise strikes that began to cut Karn's fleet to pieces. Yet in these attacks, brilliantly coordinated as they were, Ka'Soron neglected defense, and Karn's boarding torpedoes reached the ship, Karn himself killing Ka'Soron before retreating. And with the loss of their leader, the cohesion of the Emperor's children collapsed. Captain Telemuch on Lyra's found a way to chase away Karn's few ships, securing Nuceria before succumbing to his wounds, but the Legion returned to Chemos humiliated by their victory, as the survivors of Terra returned to Chemos lost without their Primarch. There, it was Captain Lucius, recovering from his near-death experience on Terra, that galvanized the Legion. He spoke of the need to continue striving for perfection, and of the potential for greatness that the Legion still had. They might have slipped some in the losses of the betrayal, but they were still on the right path. Lucius's good friend Tarvitz became the Legion Master, whereas Lucius became the first non-Primarch to bear the title of War Master, ultimately confirmed by Malcador and the surviving loyal Primarches as Supreme Commander of Imperial Offensive Operations. Thus, it was Tarvitz who named Art as the Legion's non-combat calling, a choice that surprised nobody. Lucius stepped down as War Master after 10 years, but he and Tarvitz continued fighting on the front lines of the Imperium's reclamation, to restore the glory of the Third Legion and the dream of perfect unity. The Long War. Even as the Imperium's progress has slowed over the millennia, the Emperor's children have held on to that dream. Perfection may be unachievable, but the Third Legion holds that it is possible to be arbitrarily close to it, and that it is absolutely imperative to try. The Legion's leaders are usually the first to support great campaigns of conquest, often chafing under the overall caution of the Imperium. Above all, the Emperor's children are ambitious in choosing their projects, in art and in battle alike, their ultimate aim being the final fulfillment of their Primarch's dream. Saul Tarvitz leads the Legion still. He suffered mortal wounds at the Battle of Thessala against the nomads of the Diasporex, but the intervention of the Ultramarines under Guilliman himself allowed his body to be interred in one of the first Eternal-class dreadnoughts, invented a decade earlier by a collaboration with the Emperor's children's chief apothecary Fabius as deputy, Fabius himself tragically dying 30 years later due to his self-experimentation. Since then, Tarvitz has stepped down several times, sometimes for centuries, but has always ultimately returned to Legion Master. Lucius too has been interned in an Eternal Dreadnought, uniquely not due to injuries suffered in battle but rather accumulated radiation damage and consequent aging, across over a millennium of active service. That's the irony of it all, Emish. Saul doesn't want it. He was entirely content to be a line officer, to focus on being perfect within his position, but circumstances outpaced him. But do not take that to mean that he has an excess of false humility. Saul is driven to do the best he can in any position he is in, not for himself, not even a little bit, but only for the Legion and for the dream. He doesn't want to lead the Legion, but neither does he want to avoid that leadership. And that is why he is the perfect choice, one no one over 10,000 years has compared to. It is a different situation to mine, a completely different one. I stepped down as War Master after a decade because War Master is a position for youth and ambition. Tarvitz is still Legion Master after 1,000 decades because that is a position for experience and dedication. The offensive War Master embodies the Primarch's expansion of the Imperium. The Legion Master embodies his salvation of Chemos. Lucius. The Emperor's children have participated in countless campaigns over the millennia. In M32, it was the Emperor's children that shattered the remnants of the Beast's empire after the Beast's death, putting a final end to the most severe orc threat between Olanar and Armageddon, albeit that triumph was marred by the fact that it was in large part their own supply lines that the Beast had so skillfully cut, and that the Green Tide did put an end to the Imperium's greatest post-betrayal period of extension, some would say overextension. In late M34, they crippled the Eldarcraft world Lugganath, failing to completely destroy it but reducing it to a Wraithstone skeleton and stopping its ability to strike at the Imperium for a millennium. Between 610.M36 and 660.M36, in the Dark Marches Crusade, hundreds of worlds were secured and added to the Imperium in a slow encirclement, despite interference from a massive Hrud migration. In late M39, an armada that included 3 millennials was feared lost in the Orden Rift of Segmentum Tempestus, yet as it turned out, they had in fact traversed the rift and conquered 300 worlds beyond it. Their specialization is demonstrated by the fact that since the War of the Beast, the Emperor's children have added more worlds to the Imperium than any 2 other legions combined. There have been defeats as well, though, among the worst recent ones being the Battle of Ikorax, where an incipient campaign was undercut by Necrons, who ultimately exterminated the entire population of Ikorax, including 200 Emperor's children stationed there. The Legion's attention is not fixed solely outwards. The realm of Eagles is well defended, and at times there is a need to reclaim the Imperium's frontiers, such as in the War of the Makarian Heresy. The generals of War Master Makarius, one of the few offensive War Masters chosen from outside the 3rd Legion, and the only one to not be an Astarte, dishonored their great leader's name by turning to chaos, and Lord Commander Verant Ortiz led the Emperor's children into a reconquest. Even more recently, Tarvitz himself broke a major salamander invasion of the Imperium that threatened Chemos itself, killing the warlord Enkel non-Desert Scoria. The Emperor's children are not warriors alone. The galleries of the Pride of the Emperor demonstrate as much, as do the carefully shaped landscapes of Chemos. But they are all, undoubtedly, warriors, fighting relentlessly for the same ideals they believed in 10 millennia ago, refined but not corrupted by the passage of time. Many have said that in doing so, they seek the impossible. When a scion of the Phoenician hears that, he laughs. They are Astaroths, and Emperor's children at that. What worth is there, for them, in goals that are not impossible? Organization. Since the death of their Primarch, the Emperor's children are led by a Legion Master, Saul Tarvitz usually filling that position, who is guarded and linked to the Legion by the 30 Phoenix Guard. Important decisions, however, are taken by a council of the Lord's Commander, numbering 13, the Legion Master, War Master, 3 specialist leaders, and the leaders of the first 8 millennials. There are 30 millennials in total, the leaders of the remaining 22 being referred to as tribunes. Each millennial is further divided into 30 captain-led companies numbering up to 150 Astaroths. The first millennial has a special status, with every rank within it being considered a half rank above the equivalent in any other millennial and its warriors being outfitted accordingly. Companies are generally divided into squads of 10 with some number of specialists answering directly to the captain. There are 3 orders of specialists within the Emperor's children, all 3 quite powerful and each making up about 7% of the Legion. The Nave Architects are responsible for the construction and upkeep of the Legion's mechanical elements, but above all its fleet, as well as traditionally commanding individual ships. The Librarians fulfill a broadly similar role to those of other legions, but they tend to focus on using their powers as a part of their style, as opposed to relying entirely on them in combat. The Apothecaries, following the example of the great Fabius, have in addition to their main duties a strong affinity towards biotechnological research, though the war beasts and forest cities they have created sometimes skirt the edge of the forbidden. Uniquely, Apothecaries and Nave Architects are both seconded to Mars for a time, in part to ensure they stay on the correct side of that edge. The title of Offensive War Master, with Robert Gilliman remaining as the other, Defensive War Master since the time of the Great Crusade, is assigned by a decision of the Lord's Commander to a new candidate every 20 years, a right given to the Emperor's children in honor of their Primarch. Most often this is a promising tribune or captain, more rarely, an exceptional sergeant or one of the Lord's Commander themselves. On several occasions the title has been assigned to a member of another legion, and on one occasion, that of Makarius, to a general of the Imperial Army. The offensive war master holds a position of absolute authority over offensive operations of the Imperium under the regent himself, though it is a poor war master that does not lead by consensus. While a war master's term lasts 2 decades at most, they are judged by the consequences of their tenure as much as for that tenure itself. There is an additional hierarchy in the Legion besides normal rank, the Course Glorious. It consists of a competitive and semi-formal accounting of achievements in art and personal combat, with the highest achievers being those who blend successes in both. Walking the Course Glorious, however, must never take priority over acting for the good of the Legion. Overly selfish actions are heavily discounted in value, and those whose focus on glory crosses the line into irresponsibility face the same punishment they would in any other legion. Those Asteroutes who have been among the top 30 of the course earn the title of Palatine, forming an informal order. Combat Doctrine. The Emperor's children tend heavily towards offensive combat, taking worlds more often than they defend them. Their strategy is adaptable, but when a diplomatic solution is impossible, often they will follow up an orbital bombardment with escalating strikes against secondary power centers, via drop-pod assault, that link up and ultimately surround the enemy core, quickly enough to continuously keep that enemy on their back foot, or back tentacle, etc. Locations not of military significance are often ignored, so long as scouting confirms their irrelevance. The civilian population is not the Legion's concern. In defense, they tend to counterattack often, emphasizing retaining mobility rather than sitting back behind fortress walls, as well as being fond of using genetically crafted war beasts. In both cases, they will often fight alongside the Imperial Army, other legions, the Mechanicum, and other Imperial forces. Other legions may be more integrated into civilian society, but the Emperor's children are experts at navigating the martial politics of the Imperium and at combined arms fighting in general. For this reason, the Legion's specialization is less a problem than it might otherwise seem. On the individual scale, the Emperor's children have a strong preference for melee, and especially for sword fighting. This is not simply tradition, but a consequence of the fact that melee combat tends to rely more on personal skill, and thus offers an area to excel in. Nonetheless, generally Emperor's children carry bolters as well as blades, and use them when that offers a strategic advantage. Even the most brilliant victory in a sword fight is ugly if it was useless. The Legion maintains a large fleet, but its doctrine of void warfare is most characteristic for a focus on fighters and supercapital carriers. Every millennial features a Titanic flagship, and the first millennial's flagship, the Pride of the Emperor, destroyed in M34 but rebuilt from the fragments, is the size of a small moon, bearing weaponry to match. Of course, those flagships are architectural marvels as well as nightmares to fight. Individual nave architects that do not command a major ship, meanwhile, go to the opposite end of the scale, flying single-pilot ships, taking pride in wielding their fighters with the same precision that other Emperor's children wield their blades. Home world. The home world of the Emperor's children is Chemos. When the Eagle Star landed on it, it was a mining world that had not run out of minerals, but was running out of food. A planet that was losing the knowledge base necessary to maintain its factories, a civilization that no longer valued anything except back-breaking labor. The Phoenician led a renaissance of first industry and then culture, returning the concepts of art, hobbies, and relaxation to the tongue of Chemos. With it, he peacefully unified the world politically under his own person. Chemos has remained under the direct rule of the Legion Master of the Emperor's children, as have 12 of the closest worlds to it, which together form the Realm of Eagles. Unlike Ultramar, the Realm of Eagles did not experience mission creep, and thus has remained a distinct administrative unit. Today those 12 worlds are apparent garden planets, whose carefully engineered ecosystems hide a great deal of industry. Chemos is the exception. Its large-scale factories have long since been either dismantled or made into museums, but it retains research labs and artisanal workshops, as well as an intricate system of defenses. In the end, though, Chemos is a military world, and its people know that, while the Emperor's children recruit throughout the Imperium, large fractions of their cadres are taken from open trials held annually in their fortress monastery, Fusor, which rises like a violet mountain under the Rhine forests of equatorial Chemos. Beliefs. The Emperor's children hold to an expansive and expansionist version of the imperial truth. They believe the Imperium can and will conquer not just the galaxy, but the entire universe, eventually. They emphasize not only logic, but perfection and the daring to do what seems impossible. If one does not try one's absolute best, one will never accomplish anything, for it is better to have a high aim and miss it than to have a low one and hit it. That said, the emphasis is on excellence as part of the Legion, and there is a great cultural revulsion towards those who fight for their own advancement rather than for the dream and for the art, which is not to deny that selfish ambition is a common flaw in the Legion. Formally, the Emperor's children do not see themselves as the best of the Imperial legions, for each of the 10 has their place. Informally, many in the Legion are proud of it to the point of arrogance. It is no accident that when the Emperor's children fail, it is usually due to overconfidence or overextension. Notably, while the Legion respects the Emperor like the others, the Phoenician is almost worshipped. The custom, following a decree by Tarvitz, is not to speak or write his given name, outside of histories about periods before this custom became ingrained, except in a moment of sublime achievement, at which point the Phoenician is thanked, not as a god, though some skeptics have interpreted it that way, but in the manner of a muse of war. Gene Seed. Despite the loss of their primarch and significant attrition in offensive campaigns, the infrastructure and selectiveness of the Emperor's children ensure that their gene seed remains a model of purity, if sometimes at the cost of lowered activity. Additionally, while tampering with Legion gene seed itself is strictly forbidden, apothecaries often make additional minor physical enhancements to Marines, treatments that often improve speed and longevity at the cost of requiring continued maintenance, though any augmentations with a large chance of impacting the mind are firmly avoided. Rebel Lien stood before the vast vault, staring past the layers of screens at the gene seed. The future of the Legion, as the apothecaries said. He did not come here often, indeed, he did not come back to Chemos often. Or had not, for the last 20 years. The theater of command of a war master was great, but Chemos was Tarvitz's, not his. But now his term was almost over, and so he returned to the home world, perhaps to brood. It did not help that his burn scars were beginning to ache again. He'd need something more permanent done than could be managed aboard the Of Unity. As it was, had he done well enough? He considered the Wheel of Fire campaign to be a strategic masterstroke, and containing the Sith Orphenes with as few forces as he had sent was also something to be immensely proud of. But the repeated failures in the Damocles Gulf were frustrating, against a lesser foe they would even be embarrassing. Well, it wasn't as if he was actually going anywhere. He would have a chance to secure his victories and avenge his defeats with sword in hand. As it was, Rebel Lien turned away from the vault to walk to the meeting. The architecture was more interesting than the contents, really. The future of the Legion, yes, but as Revelion's cape suddenly stretched with a gust of wind, the War Master having emerged onto a roof, he saw, far below, the true future of the Legion. The Chemiad, of course, the trials were happening right now. Hundreds of children in this amphitheater alone, a detailed cross-section of the realm of eagles and elites from across the Imperium. All of them were there for their own reasons, carrying their own achievements and grudges and dreams. Some of the younger ones might join the first cadre of the new millennium in half a decade, came a synthesized voice from behind him, and Rebel Lien wondered how distracted he must have been not to see Saul Tarvitz. 400 years since I stood there myself, Rebel Lien said, turning to face the Legion Master and nodding to the 2 Phoenix Guard flanking him. Unlike a Primarch, there were times, rare as they were, when Tarvitz actually needed a bodyguard. I suppose that is nothing to you, of course. Not entirely, Tarvitz said, and Rebel Lien imagined there must have been an expression of longing on his face deep within the sarcophagus. The generations are different from each other, and they do not always cycle back to what they were. Above all, their brightest stars are different. Rebel Lien nodded, taking the aspirants back in. Though few of them shine as brightly as your own generation. I did my best, but there seems to be so little I had time to do. A touch of frustration, even jealousy, may have slipped into his voice. He knew it was baseless, but it was nonetheless there, in his mind if not in his speech. You are not the first War Master to tell me so, Tarvitz answered after a pause. But I think this new cadre may surprise you yet. Tarvitz paused again before continuing. As might your own. You know, some say that we avoid neural implants and excessive hypnoconditioning because of cowardice. Because we're scared of losing our identities, Rebel Lien agreed, unsure of why Tarvitz was taking the tangent. But we both know the Legion Master finished, that it is because perfection cannot be duplicated, because each of us must find our own path. And tomorrow's perfection, too, cannot be measured on the scale of yesterday's or today's. A new era is coming, War Master, I can feel it. For good or ill, Legion Master. It is coming for ill, Tarvitz said. But who would we be, if we did not turn it towards good? Battle cry. The official motto of the Legion is a quote of the Phoenician, perfection is the limit of achievement, yet it is an infinite limit. But in battle, the Emperor's children universally use a battle cry that dates back to before the betrayal, children of the Emperor. Death to his foes. 999.M41. Legion Master Saul Tarvitz picked up the laurel wreath gently, his claw flexing in carefully measured motion, before taking 2 steps, thunderous in the silence of the ceremony, and he supposed plenty loud otherwise as well, and tossing it, in a spiraling throw, to anoint the statue's head. It was perfect, of course. He had practiced this toss 1,000 times before each time he'd made it. The marble visage of the Phoenician, carved in a staggering likeness that genuinely captured a small fraction of the living Primarch's charisma, looked down on his sons proudly. In moments like this, Tarvitz thought, his father had reason to be proud. Within one hand, Fulgrim's statue held his blade, and the other held aloft a torch. It was to this torch that Tarvitz now looked and, suddenly, realized the words he had to speak. To your memory, Fulgrim Eaglestar, he rumbled. The warriors aligned on the triumphal field were, without a doubt, suppressing gasps at his seemingly casual mention of their common father's name, even by the one who had limited its usage in the first place. Let them, Tarvitz decided. And to this millennium, he continued, turning to face them, insofar as he had a face. To all that the Emperor's children have done over 1,000 years, and to all they will do in the next 1,000. In the memory of those we lost, and those we will yet lose, and in honor of the victories we have won, and the victories to come. Children of the Emperor. Death to his foes. Came the echo, deafening even to Tarvitz's sensors. We will not falter, he said. We will not settle. We will keep fighting until infinity. For the Primarch, for the Emperor, and for humanity. He punctuated the words with a shot of his ancient heavy conversion beamer, which was nowadays fitted to his chassis only for ceremonial occasions such as this one. For a moment, the flame held in the statue's hand went out, blown away by the force of the shot. The next, the very energy within the blast reignited it again, a ball of lightning and then of fire, the legacy of the Legion reborn. And Saul Tarvitz realized, in that moment of perfect clarity, that this was the last time he was performing this ceremony, and that he would not be repeating even its lesser, centurial version. For he felt a power, even in the warp that he bore no connection to, a power that within the next century. Magnus had told him, when the succession of the Legion had been settled. He knew it, and Lucius, and Kasparos Telmar, but no one else in the Legion, besides those 3 eternal dreadnoughts. Most souls, in the warp, were torn apart by daemons, some, which had extreme psychic power or which had planned for the eventuality, could persist past the death of their body. But those who were truly revered by the galaxy, those would accrete power instead of shedding it, and in due time become conscious powers of their own in the Empyrean. Fulgrim, the beloved, the favored son, the brightest star, Fulgrim satisfied those criteria with ease. Their father, Magnus had said, might return to them in less than a millennium. But the thoughts that formed into a power determined its nature, not only who they had been in life, and that terrified Tarvitz, in a form that he had thought he had left behind with his humanity. For his father would not be as he had been, indeed, he would, normally, invariably be lesser. He would represent, normally, loss and sacrifice, and then, very possibly, an enemy. Thus, the decree. Thus, the need to associate the Phoenician's name and true name only with the uppermost reaches of perfection's ascent, both within the Legion and outside it. It delayed his return, greatly, and some would have blamed Tarvitz for it had they suspected. But, so the concept went, the Phoenician would turn into not a being defined by his dubious moments, but only by his brightest. And soon, Tarvitz realized, he would know, if he did not ironically die just beforehand, whether it had all been in vain. Soon, Fulgrim Eaglestar, savior of Chemos, Primarch of the Emperor's children, or, at least, an echo of him, would return, into the firestorm of the end times ignition. Check the description for the links to the author.